Hey everyone, Scott here to discuss Apollo 13, starring Tom Hanks, Ed Harris, Bill Paxton, Kevin Bacon, Gary Sinise, and Kathleen Quinlan, and directed by Ron Howard. I didn't see this in theaters, but I do remember seeing this quite a bit as a kid. And what do I think of it? Let's get into it, shall we? In 1969, we get an introduction of how space and the Apollo missions work, and we started a party at the Lovell house, led by Jim Lovell, played by Tom Hanks, and his wife Marilyn, played by Kathleen Quinlan, as they celebrate the success of Jim as well as the other astronaut colleagues, Fred Hayes, played by Bill Paxton, and Ken Mattingly, played by Gary Sinise, but Jack Swigert is there, who's played by Kevin Bacon, as Jim and Marilyn see the moon at nighttime, and I enjoy being around these guys as astronauts, and this has a good character development. Jim gets to go to the moon on the Apollo 13 mission 6 months from Halloween night. We move on to 3 months left as they practice moving the rocket ship with Ken Mattingly, played by Gary Sinise, as I already brought up. And while they're practicing, Marilyn dreams of Jim's death in space, and she fears for her husband's life, is what I got the impression of how she's feeling as she's scared for him, which is a typical white thing, I will admit. And director Ron Howard does a good job on showing us how the characters are feeling without telling the audience, and that's what a movie has to do. We move on to the next year, 1970, as we see Jim, Fred, Ken, taking pictures and being interviewed by the press 4 days before the mission and 2 days before Jim has been forced to include Jack on the Apollo 13 mission and remove Ken, as Ken is upset about it. And he trains for the next day or two as he manually controls the ship as the crashes as he crashes the ship and kills the astronauts off on a computer, I'll say, not in real life. And Marilyn comes to the launch to support Jim, and I like their chemistry as they're cute together. The next day, they go to the rocket to take off the moon as we meet Gene Kranz, played by Ed Harris, as he's in control of the Apollo 13 mission, as they are prepared to launch, and they blast off while Ken watches the launch, and the shots in space are absolutely magnificent. The fifth engine isn't on, but that won't stop them as they're finally in space. And I'm loving when they're in space because you can't expect what will end up happening, as I'm on the edge of my seat every single time I watch this movie. They luckily attach themselves to another rocket as we move on to day 3 after takeoff, and they post a live broadcast as they see things floating, with gravity. And it always fascinates me how gravity in outer space works, as I'm fascinated by this scene. Even if it's done right in any movie that's supposed to be science fiction, but a movie based on fact, like a true story like this movie, the classic line, Houston, we have a problem, comes as something bad happens with the vents. That'll eventually give them no oxygen to the point they'll smash on the moon and die in Houston. It suggests to turn off the power on fuel cells 1 and 3, which is a way for the oxygen to come back from the vents. And they lost the moon, and the oxygen ends up from 200 to 0. And they try to get the power back, and I worry about these astronauts while on the mission. And the acting by Tom Hanks, Bill Paxton, and Kevin Bacon are absolutely tremendous, and the effects look very well done. Meanwhile, at home, Marilyn wants to know what happened to Jim as Houston shuts down the power. As Gene talks with the rest of the Houston team, as they're talking about a new mission that'll get Jim, Fred, and Jack back home. As we move on to day 4, as President Nixon wants to abandon them, but Gene refuses to do that, and the score is really good in this movie, as it's honorable and inspiring as it connects me to the movie. They land on the moon as Jim sees Earth, and his thumb is bigger than Earth, which is a beautiful shot, by the way. These shots are beautiful, in my opinion. Meanwhile, Houston gives Apollo 13 45 hours to get home, and G knows it won't get them home in that amount of time. It brings Ken into landing the rocket, which is the right thing to do on Houston's part, and did make the movie earn that moment, in my opinion. The news people want to interview Marilyn, but she declines and says to take it up with her husband as the astronauts feel cold in the ship, as Fred doesn't look good as we get to know him as a character. And I like that we do know these characters right off the bat, although there are some intense peril in this movie, and it works very well. Jack does some math and realizes they're going in too fast, and Jack and Fred have an argument until Houston talks to the astronauts and tells them how hard they're working on getting them home. And while I was busy being scared for the characters, I couldn't help but admire how smart this movie really is. Marilyn and the family visit Grandma Lovell to tell her there was an accident on the rocket and tells her Jim is fine but won't be able to walk on the moon, and tells one of his daughters that Jim can land on a washing machine as Jim is sick and tired of the doctors telling him to calm down his kidneys, and takes off the medical wire, and Fred and Jack does the same thing after Jim took off his. And Fred is getting sicker as Jim gets more bad news from Houston as they can't find a way to get them back to Earth, and Jim suggests driving it manually. And they do so with Houston's okay, and are successful on getting a little closer to Earth, which felt like a ride at Universal Studios. Meanwhile, Ken tries to find a way to get them back to Earth, while the Lovell family and neighbors watch Jim's interview on the TV as the astronauts need a way to get home, as they have very little time, as Ken and Jean gets frustrated about how soon they need to get them home, and Ken figures out a way and tells them what to do and are successful as Neil Armstrong and his partner Buzz Aldrin watches the TV with Grandma Lovell, and I'm glad they're getting out of it alive, as this movie works very well as a suspense drama. As they get closer to home, Jim stares down on Earth while Marilyn stares up in the sky as they detach the rockets, and Jim lets Jack sit in the pilot's seat, and as a helicopter comes for the astronauts from the USS Iwo Jima, as guess is what it's called, as they start getting to Earth, and the rocket goes on fire, and the reporters are outside the Lovell home as the rocket lands and water, and they make it back alive, which, whew, what a miracle of a great ending. Now it's time for the rating. I'll give this movie a 8.3 out of 10. I enjoy being around these guys as astronauts, as I was on the edge of my seat the entire time, but the space scenes were nicely shot. I really admire how smart the script is, as well as this movie works very well as an intense drama. The score is tremendous, and at the end of the day, the movie is tremendous. These astronauts are great characters to watch on screen. So I'd like to thank you guys for joining me for this review, and until next time, Houston, we have a problem.